I still have that clock on my office wall, the one with the soft, rhythmic ticking that usually helps my patients feel grounded. But that afternoon, the ticking didn't sound like a clock anymore. It sounded like a hammer, striking a hollow pipe inside my own skull. I remember reaching for my water glass, seeing my hand start to blur, and then the strangest thing happened. I didn't feel myself fall. I felt the floor rise up to meet me, as if the room was trying to catch me before I disappeared. And then, the ticking stopped. But I could still hear something else. Something that shouldn't and oppose have been there. Looking back now, I think my body had been trying to tell me something for months. Being a therapist is heavy. You spend your day holding space for everyone else and oppose, as ghosts, their traumas, their broken pieces. I'm good at it. Or I thought I was. I remember that morning being particularly cold. I'd been feeling this weird. It wasn't oppose, pain exactly. It was more like thinness in my chest. Like I was made of paper and a strong wind might just tear right through me. I was sitting with a client, a young man struggling with deep-seated guilt. I remember looking at him and feeling this overwhelming urge to tell him, it's okay to just breathe, but I realized I wasn't oppose, breathing either. My lungs felt stiff. After he left, I had 20 minutes before my next session. I decided to make a cup of herbal tea. I remember the smell of the chamomile. It was so sharp, almost aggressive. Everything was becoming hyper-vivid. The light coming through the blinds looked like solid gold bars leaning against the wall. I felt a sudden, cold sweat break out across my neck. I thought, I just need to sit down. I'm just tired, just burned out. I walked back to my mahogany desk, the one I'd saved up for years to buy. I sat down and reached for my planner. But my fingers, they wouldn't oppose, close. I stared at my hand as if it belonged to a mannequin. It was just resting there, pale, remote. And then the silence hit. Not the normal quiet of a therapy office, but a heavy, pressurized silence. Like being deep underwater. I tried to call out. I thought if I could just make a sound, I could break the spell. But my voice was gone. The last thing I remember seeing was the corner of a picture frame on my desk. It was tilted just a few degrees to the left. I remember thinking, I should fix that. Everything became quiet. I didn't feel the impact when I hit the floor. I didn't feel the coldness of the tiles or the sharp edge of the desk. It was just a sudden cessation of wait, You dawn and oppose, realize how heavy it is to be human until that weight is suddenly lifted. Every breath you and oppose, ever struggled for, every muscle ache, every ounce of gravity, it just evaporated. I felt like I was floating in a dark, warm sea. There was no Natalie anymore. No therapist, number 39-year-old woman, no bills to pay, no schedules to keep. I was just a point of awareness. I remember thinking, oh, so this is what it's like to stop. The darkness wasn't oppose, scary. It was like a velvet curtain. It felt protective. Then, the physical sensations started to fade entirely. Usually, when your foot goes to sleep, it tingles. This wasn't oppose, that. This was a slow, methodical switching off, One by one, the lights of my senses were being dimmed. First, the smell of the chamomile tea, gone. Then, the distant sound of traffic outside on the street, faded to nothing. Finally, the feeling of my own skin. I couldn't oppose, feel where ended and the air began. I was expanding. And then, for a brief moment, I felt a strange flick of panic. Not because I was dying, but because I realized I had left the door to my office unlocked. It's funny, isn't it? Even at the edge of the universe, the mind clings to these tiny, mundane anxieties. But then, that panic just dissolved into the dark. I felt a pull, not a physical tug, but a magnetic invitation. I wasn't oppose, being taken. I was being allowed to go, and that's when I saw the ceiling. But I wasn't oppose, looking up at it. I was brushing against it. I was hovering, right near the light fixture in the center of the ceiling. From up there, everything looked different. Smaller. I saw a woman lying on the rug. She was wearing my favorite navy blue blazer and those sensible heels I always complained about. Her face was pressed against the carpet. One arm was tucked awkwardly under her chest. I looked at her, and for a second, I didn't oppose, recognize her. I thought, that poor woman. Someone should help her. And then it clicked. That's me. That's Natalie. But the strange thing was, I didn't feel any connection to that body. It felt like looking at a coat I had taken off and dropped on the floor. It was just fabric. I saw my notepad lying open a few feet away. I could see my own handwriting, scribbles about a patient and as childhood dream. It looked so insignificant. All those years of studying, the degrees on the wall, the careful way I chose my words to help people, none of it mattered from this height. I watched a fly land on the window pane. I could see the dust motes dancing in a shaft of sunlight. Everything was moving in slow motion. Then, I noticed something I hadn't seen when I was down there. Under my desk, there was a small, silver coin. It must have been there for months. I'd walked past it 1,000 times and never noticed. I remember feeling this sudden, sharp clarity. We spend our whole lives looking at the big things, but from here, the silver coin was just as important as my career. There was no fear, even as I watched my own chest, not moving. I wasn't gasping for air because I didn't need air anymore. I felt a sense of detachment, but a kind, gentle detachment. And then, the walls of my office started to grow transparent. I could see through the bricks, through the insulation, out into the city. But the city wasn't made of stone anymore. It was made of light, and I realized I was being pulled through the ceiling, not into the attic, but into somewhere else. The office was gone. I found myself in a space that I don't have the words for really. It wasn't a place. It was a state. Everything was white, but not a blinding white. It was soft, like 1,000 morning suns filtered through silk. It felt holy, and then I felt a presence. I didn't see a face. I didn't see a figure, but I felt an intelligence that knew everything about me. Every secret, every mistake, every time I'd ever lied to myself. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't judged. As a therapist, I spend my life trying to offer unconditional positive regard to my patients. But I realized in that moment, I had never given it to myself. The presence showed me a ripple. It wasn't a movie of my life, but a feeling of the energy I'd put out. I saw all the times I had been kind. I saw the times I'd stayed late to help a grieving mother, the times I'd spoken softly to a stranger. I thought these were my best moments. But the light showed me something else. It showed me that my kindness was often a shield. I was being kind so that people wouldn't see how much I was hurting inside. I was using my service to others to ignore the rod in my own foundation. I felt this wave of forgiveness. It washed over me like warm water. The light whispered, not in words, but in a direct transfer of thought. You were so busy tending to the gardens of others that you let your own soil turn to dust. I saw that the damage I'd ignored in myself, the burnout, the loneliness, the childhood wounds I thought I'd processed was actually what made me human. And it was okay. I felt a love so profound that it felt like every cell in my non-existent body was vibrating. I didn't want to leave. I wanted to dissolve into that forgiveness forever. I felt the presence of others, people I had lost, but they weren't people anymore. They were just glows of familiar joy. I remember thinking, so, this is the secret. It was never about being perfect. It was just about being honest. Then, the light began to recede. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure in my chest. I tried to reach back, to stay in that warmth. But the light said, not yet. You have to go back and be kind to Natalie first. The transition was violent. It wasn't a soft drift back. It was a slam. 1 second I was floating in that ocean of forgiveness, and the next, I was choking on the smell of floor cleaner and dust. My lungs burned. It felt like someone had poured liquid lead into my veins. The I mentioned earlier, it came back 1,000 times heavier. I was gasping, my cheek pressed against the hard office rug. I remember the first thing I saw was that silver coin under the desk, the one I'd seen from the ceiling. I reached out and touched it. It was cold, real. I lay there for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour, just listening to my own heart. It sounded like a drum in an empty hall. Eventually, I managed to crawl to my desk and pull myself up. Everything looked the same, but everything was different. The mahogany desk, the degrees on the wall, the books, they were just things now. They didn't define me anymore. It's been 3 years since that afternoon. The doctors called it a syncope episode caused by extreme stress and an undiagnosed heart murmur. They gave me pills and told me to rest. But they couldn't explain what I saw. I'm still a therapist, but I'm a different one now. I don't just sit and listen anymore. I tell my patients the truth, that they can't heal anyone else until they stop ignoring the bleeding inside themselves. I spend more time in silence. I don't fear the end. How can you fear something that felt more like home than life itself? Sometimes, when the office gets quiet and the clock starts its rhythmic ticking, I look at that silver coin, which I now keep in a small glass jar on my desk. It reminds me that I'm not just a person with a job and a name. I'm a fragment of that light, just trying to learn how to be kind to the woman in the navy blue blazer. I still don't have all the answers, but I know one thing for sure. We are never as alone as we think we are, even when the door is locked and the lights go out.